Telescope Club by Kaya Lee Cohen. 2. January 10th, 2022. The Telescope Club made a landmark discovery. They made contact with planets OK. The sphere they'd been sighting for decades finally showed a sign of life, which could be better described as a vague and cryptic cry for help. The Telescope Club felt even more in the dark than before they got word from the planet they worshipped. They did not know how they were expected to help a planet so far out in the universe that it was only visible by telescope. Everyone in the club was there because of one woman. Irene Green was the first to spot the planet in 1852. Her father was an optometrist with a keen interest in seeing further, so he kept making stronger lenses that could stare farther and farther into space. The two lived on a very remote island off the East Canadian coast with just over 1,000 inhabitants. Irene's mother, Violet, died giving birth to her, as her mother's mother, Winona, had as well. So it had just been her and her father for 6 years now. 7 days a week, her father homeschooled her. Her schooling was very integrated into daily life on the island, where inhabitants were largely self-sufficient. Irene learned to forage and hunt, and at 6 years old, she could identify all of the constellations in the night sky and read the daily paper. At 6, she was more intelligent than 75% of the islanders. One evening, upon peering through her father's handmade telescope, Irene noticed something out of the ordinary in the night sky she knew so well. It was a bright green shining sphere right in the middle of a palette of stars. She wiped the lens off with the sleeve of her sweater and looked again, unable to believe her eyes. "Father!" she exclaimed from the balcony. She whipped her head around to look into the parlor room at Dr. Green, her father, smoking his pipe and reading his paper. His head was tilted up, eyes down, peering through spectacles dangling at the tip of his nose. He glanced up from his reading, put out his pipe, and, with some effort, hoisted himself from his chair to meet his daughter on the balcony. The two were quite close, and following her out to the balcony wasn't out of a desire to humor or entertain her. He almost always learned something new when she pointed out a discovery. Even before she learned to speak, she was his secret weapon. "What have you found, Rainey?" Look through here, and don't move the telescope." Dr. Green took off his reading glasses and put them in his suit pocket. He bent down to peer through the telescope. She kept her cheek touching his while he directed his eye through the lens. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, a color more vibrant than any on Earth or in the sky. He pulled his face from the oculus, and she quickly pushed hers back in. He turned his head to her, so that when she pulled away, they were eye to eye. Father hunching down, daughter tiptoed on a stool, both united by the same telescope and the same brand new, unbelievable planet in the sky. They had found something incredible. Dr. Green rushed into his study and came back with an atlas of the night sky. He held it up to the view above. The green orb they spotted should have been just to the left of the Little Dipper, but the book showed no indication of such a star. It was a planet that appeared out of thin air. He scurried back to his study to collect a series of items: graph paper, pencils, a protractor, and his leather notebook. Dr. Green and Irene began to map out the night sky, staring at their little green planet. While Irene drew with calculation on the graph paper, Dr. Green wrote down as many observations as he could in his notebook, occasionally glancing over and giving his daughter pointers on her mapping. They carried on like this until the sun came up and the stars were no longer visible, and by then their eyes were heavier than boulders. Dr. Green went to the kitchen to make them some toast and tea, and by the time he came back out, Irene was curled up in his chair, asleep. After she woke, around noontime, the day passed in a lazy daze. The two naturally took a break from Irene's studies to study the pertinent discovery from the previous night. They spent the remainder of the day holed up in Dr. Green's study, poring over newspapers and encyclopedias to find evidence of prior sightings of the celestial object. They searched in every book for any relevant word of observation from Dr. Green's past night's entry in his leather notebook. They compared Irene's sky map to every celestial atlas image. By the time the daylight diminished, they had found no indication that anyone else had ever experienced such a sighting. When darkness fell, the planet was gone. Irene and Dr. Green waited, taking turns peering through the telescope on the balcony. They waited all of that night, and the majority of the next one, and the next one, and a bit of the next, and the next, and the next. They spent many hours out on the balcony, looking through the telescope every night for months after that initial finding. It wasn't until the weather grew frigid and ice hung from the overhang on their balcony that they spotted it again. For the next several years, Irene and her father kept their eyes on the planet. It would disappear and reappear with no rhyme or reason. It became the epicenter of Irene's schooling. Any type of math, science, or philosophy book would tie back into their secret in the sky. Every problem she solved and every word she read, she used in an attempt to answer her burning questions about the planet. How was it such a color? What made it so prominent in the sky one day and absent the next? Why were there no other records of the planet? Irene studied astronomy, physics, mathematics, biology, psychology, poetry, and everything in between. Her hypotheses about the planet ranged from having scientific basis that just barely missed total proof to imaginative absurdities spun out of her dreams. When she was 11, she believed that the planet got its green from a special species of tree that had a unique luminescent property because its seed drifted from Earth through outer space before germinating on the planet. From the ages 13 to 15, she spent every waking moment trying to prove that the planet was a result of the sun's light refracting off of methane from cow farts. She looked into every rotation and fluctuation of numerous stars and planets, and each subtle possible change in the atmospheric temperature due to human development. Her research went as far back as the Big Bang. And by 18, despite having a set of knowledge equivalent to that of a grown man with multiple PhDs, Irene could only speculate about the truth of her planet, which she had named Planet Zoke, after the glowing Z in a darker shade of green streaking across the planet. Dr. Green knew that Irene had well outgrown his capacities for teaching. She had read all of the books in his study at least 3 times through, and his small telescopes were not powerful enough to allow her to see what she was looking for. So, on her 19th birthday, he wrote a letter to every observatory in the world he could find record of. To whom this may concern. In 1852, 101 years ago, my daughter and I were exploring the night sky through one of my handmade telescopes, and we saw an extraordinary celestial object. I do not write to inform you of our findings, for there are few concrete explanations at this moment in time. No, I write to you today to implore you to take notice of my daughter, who has the night sky memorized as if it were inside of her scalp. She can recite the periodic table quicker and more accurately than another girl her age can stick out her pinky to drink from her teacup. Her mathematics are stronger than those of any man teaching at the university, let alone attending it. Her curiosity is comparable to the likes of Galileo or Da Vinci. I guarantee you that Irene Violet Winona Green, now 19, is qualified to work as a scientist in your program. Sincerely, Dr. Harold Joseph Green. The island where Irene and her father lived was small and close-knit. There was a village center that consisted of a town hall, a church, and a schoolhouse. Irene and her father attended 2 of the 3 of those establishments. She had never been to a day of school in her life. This wasn't uncommon for a woman of her age, but Irene's intelligence was, because not many women on the island had the opportunity to learn as much as she had in her 19 years. For this reason, Irene was somewhat of a topic of gossip amongst the ladies in town. At gatherings on holidays or special occasions, Irene knew they were snickering at her, and she couldn't quite figure out how to relate to any of them. Her father said they were jealous, but Irene thought it was more than that. Each Christmas, there was a potluck at the town hall. Her father encouraged their attendance of such occasional social commitments, despite Irene's disdain for them. Irene used to make a fuss every year, practically kicking and screaming out the door. She'd sulk for the entire hour or so they were out, and even hid behind her father's legs when she was small. But she was grown now, and could no longer throw a temper tantrum, though she really wanted to. She was also incredibly grateful for the life her father gave her, all the effort he put into her schooling, so she'd do just about anything to please him. "Father, are you ready to go to town?" Irene stood in the doorway with a casserole in her hand. She wasn't dressed up for the occasion, but was wearing her normal wool jacket and hunting boots. She wanted to get the night over with as quickly as she could. "Be right there, sweetheart." Her father always took forever to get ready for the Christmas potluck. It was his main social event for the year, and he could never decide which tie matched which coat and which spectacles matched which tie. Finally, he settled on a blue plaid coat with a solid gray tie and his thin wire glasses, and the pair were on their way, walking through forested pathways 2 miles into town. The town hall was lit by candlelight and festively decorated with wreaths and mistletoe. It was a modest timber-frame building, barn-like, with a few benches and chairs scattered around the room for the elderly to sit down, but most townspeople were standing in groups, conversing with glasses in hand. The low chatter buzzed around the room, crescendoing and dulling in waves. As it happened each year, Irene's father was spotted and taken away by a client of his the minute they walked through the door, and Irene was left to fend for herself. She sighed, mustered up a smile, and walked over to the long table lining the back wall of the small building to set down her casserole next to the other dishes. She took her time placing the dish down, unsure of what to do with herself after the task was complete. She decided to pour herself a glass of wine and began perusing the artifacts hung on the wall. Newspaper articles, paintings, flyers for town events. She was looking in the eyes of a taxidermic rabbit when she felt a tap on the shoulder. "Remember me?" A young man with a dress shirt under his black suspenders and slicked back brown hair stood before her. He was Carl McGuire, Irene's neighbor. He'd been one of her only friends growing up. Carl's mother, Lauren, was very close with her own mother. After Irene was born and her mother deceased, Lauren assisted Dr. Green in caring for his daughter during the mourning period. Carl and Irene grew up together. Before he started going to school, they spent their days navigating the woods of their backyards and building forts in remote locations. With Dr. Green's help and his telescope, she and Carl memorized the constellations together. But once he came of schooling age, 1 year before Irene and her father discovered Zoké, Carl made other friends and didn't have time for adventures. By the time Irene turned 10, apart from the occasional run-in in the neighborhood, they barely spoke. She used to think about it a lot and miss her friend, but eventually her mind was occupied with Zoké and answering her burning questions. She recently heard murmurings that he'd been abroad and couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him, but she'd remember his face anywhere. "Of course, Carl, how are you?" "Can't complain. I'm just about done my apprenticeship." He straightened his posture and tucked his thumbs behind the straps of his suspenders. "I'm going to be the next town doctor, Irene." "Wow, Carl, I always knew you'd do great things." And she did. She only wished she could have gone to school with him. Their town wasn't yet progressive back when she was a kid. Now, girls were allowed to go to school. "Irene Green, don't you look nice?" A woman slid next to Carl, putting her arm around his waist. Irene recognized her, but didn't believe they'd ever met. "Irene, you know Josephine, don't you?" Carl in turn put his arm around Josephine's shoulders. Irene had little patience for social decorum. "I didn't, but it's nice to meet you," she said with a fixed smile. Josephine was glaring back at her, offended that Irene had the audacity to speak to her husband and pretend to not know who she was. Everyone in town should know the doctor's wife. Josephine's eye twitched, but she kept a tight smile. Irene knew that the women gossiped about her. But none had ever taken the time to introduce themselves or get to know her. She wasn't invited to go walking or ice skating or to participate in tea parties, which was okay by her because she had work to do. She knew the reason none of the women dared associate themselves with her. She had been ridiculed for years now for not caring to find a husband. "Still looking through telescopes, Irene?" Carl asked. He'd been out on the balcony many times when they were younger. "I am indeed, Carl. See anything new up there?" She felt the heat of Josephine's stare, but decided to proceed the conversation as naturally as possible with her old friend. "As a matter of fact, yes, we've discovered a planet." "A planet? You don't say." "Yes, a planet. It's bright green. I've named it Zoke." Irene began to loosen up, felt herself becoming more animated discussing something that she was comfortable with. "It seems to disappear and reappear with little explanation." Josephine snickered. "That sounds like a fable to me." Irene grew hot, but attempted to stay polite. She forced a laugh. "I know, it sounds strange. I can hardly believe myself when I say it, but it's there. Both my father and I have seen it with our own eyes." Josephine stopped a woman who was walking by on her way to refill her wine glass and motioned over to another. Girls, you must listen to this. Little Irene Green seeing things in the sky. I think we have a new village clown." By now, a small circle had joined their group. "Do go on, Irene. Tell us about this planet Zoke. Is it only visible through a pair of your father's esteemed spectacles?" Josephine mocked. Carl removed his arm from her shoulder and uncomfortably scratched the back of his head before pulling away to escape to refill his glass. Irene's gaze followed him as he turned his back to her. A group of women now surrounded her, sneering. Irene cleared her throat. "Ladies." She nodded and pushed past Josephine. She retrieved her coat and bid her father good night. She was old enough and smart enough, she felt, to not be accompanied on her walk home. Irene was disappointed and embarrassed, but not surprised, for since the girls became of marrying age, gatherings often resulted in such a manner for Irene. But her isolation was getting harder to bear. Trudging through the snow in the dark woods, illuminated by moonlight and the constellations she knew like family, Irene began to cry. She had illuminated much about the planet she had dedicated a lifetime to. A lifetime that women like Josephine spent in camaraderie with each other, bonding over activities such as embroidering, cooking, and cleaning for their husbands. In all of her time searching for answers about Zoke, Irene had never bothered to ask herself why she was so different and so alone. Dr. Green woke the next morning thinking there was a stranger in his home. Irene's hair was pinned up extravagantly, and she was wearing a dress she'd found in the attic, one that must have belonged to her mother. She'd washed and rubbed lavender on her wrists and behind her ears. She was cooking over the fire. "Sit at the table, Father. I'll have eggs ready for you in just a moment." She whipped around the kitchen, preparing a meal with focus, humming joyously. Irene and her father always took care of each other, but they usually did it collaboratively. It was not a traditional household in the sense that Dr. Green never expected Irene in the kitchen. They did chores together. Everything else revolved around his work and her studies. Thank you, Reenie." The doctor didn't know what to say. He cleared his throat and tentatively took a seat at the table. "Here you are, Father." Irene placed his plate down in front of him cheerily. She retrieved a kettle from the fireplace and poured his tea. "Irene, what's going on? Did you make progress on Zoke?" He'd never seen her this excited about anything other than her studies. She sat across from him. "Oh no, Father. I'm giving up on Zoke." She averted her eyes down into her teacup. It was a silly pastime. He was taken aback. She got up and took the chair beside him and moved her eyes to his. Staring intensely, she began, "Father, don't you think it's time I'm wed? You won't be able to take care of me forever, and before I get too old and worthless, I really should find a husband." Dr. Green set down his utensils and wiped the corners of his mouth with his handkerchief. Irene, what's this about? What do you think is going to happen, Father? I can no longer spend all my nights out on the balcony anymore. I ought to be thinking of the future. Our future. Dr. Green chuckled sympathetically. Reenie, you know I'm not dropping dead anytime soon. My business is running well. Everybody needs my help to see. He took her hand. What's really going on? Irene's body slumped as she sighed and took a pin out of her hair, wilting the tight bun. I'm not like anyone else on this island. I'm tired of being judged, Father. For once, I just want to be able to participate in town activities without being made a fool of. Irene, Dr. Green took his daughter's hand. You are not a fool, but the aptest of them all. He thought of the letters he'd written half a year prior and became angry at the lack of response. But it only motivated him more to ensure that his daughter's work was recognized. There are colorful planets out there, and nobody can see them. He lifted her chin with his pointer finger and looked her in the eyes. Nobody but us. Irene softened in his gaze and nodded. Of course. He hadn't given up so much of his time to tutor her. They had not spent all of those nights out on the balcony, all those hours taking in information to give up because she was laughed out of the small town's Christmas party. What she was doing was far more significant than the small island, than this earth perhaps. It was quite literally out of this world. By the end of the calendar year, Dr. Green still hadn't heard back from any of the observatories he had written to on his daughter's behalf. He hadn't told Irene of his inquiries for fear of exactly this. He didn't want to shake her confidence, because he knew the importance of what she was doing, even if scientists couldn't yet fathom the idea of a young girl knowing anything about space exploration. But he could wait no longer. He spent the remainder of the winter planning and found a route to North America. Between a series of ferries, buggies, and train lines, they could travel south. And as soon as the snow melted, Dr. Green was going to take his daughter to the city of Washington. He was going to get her a job at the Naval Observatory. Growing up, Irene and her father left the island about 2 times a year in order for her father to invest in the latest supplies for his optometry business. So Irene was familiar with the ferry ride over to the mainland, and she'd been on a horse and buggy to get around the city. But she never traveled farther than that, and she had never been on a train. Her eyes were glued out of the window for the duration of the train rides to America. She marveled at the vast landscapes passing, and how quickly the hills rolled into one another as the train sped. It took them 3 days and 2 trains. The first night, after the ferry ride to the mainland and a carriage to the train station, they stayed at a small inn on the southwest border of the state of Maine. In the morning, they traveled to New York, where they attempted to rest aboard their next train, which was to depart a half-day later. On their final day of travel, they arrived just before midnight to the territory of Columbia. Exhausted, Irene and Dr. Green slept soundly at the inn by the train station. In the morning, they would go into the city. The Naval Observatory was located in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood, on a hill, and took up 4 square city streets. As she and her father approached, Irene gaped at the white neoclassical structure before her. It was unlike any building Irene had ever seen before. The observatory was gigantic, with smaller wings beside a large rectangular edifice with a beautiful copper-covered dome atop it. The entranceway was guarded by 2 tall glass doors that opened into a spacious foyer. Men in uniform were bustling from room to room, notebooks in hand. Dr. Green had been so occupied planning the lengthy journey to the observatory, he hadn't given so much as a thought as to how he would proceed once they actually arrived. He didn't have an appointment, or even the slightest clue of who he needed to talk to in order to solidify his daughter a position as an astronomer. One man with round wire glasses and unkempt sandy-colored hair noticed the 2 of them looking lost. The woman's head straight up, while she spun slowly, the man turning frantically as if mustering up the courage to ask for directions. He approached the duo. "Good day," he said. Irene whipped her eyes around to land upon his, and Dr. Green spun quickly to face the man behind him. Can I help you? Oh, yes, Dr. Green tugged at his shirt. He really wished he'd given this moment more thought. We've traveled a long way. You see, I make lenses, and telescopes, that is. He presented his business card and certification. My daughter and I... He took a breath. I suppose I'm looking for someone with hiring capacities. Ah, you're looking for President Maury. I don't believe he's in yet this morning. He took the night shift. Irene's eyes widened. She wanted to be up in that dome on the night shift, staring at the chandelier of stars. He likely won't be back until late afternoon. The man noted a glaring disappointment on both of their faces. They didn't want to leave. He supposed that an optometrist had reason to be in the government observatory and decided to trust the pair. I suppose I have the morning free. I could show you around, if you'd like, until he arrives. Irene and her father nodded with excitement like schoolchildren. Oh, yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Peters, Lieutenant Sandy Peters, U.S. Navy. He stuck out his hand, and Dr. Green took it and shook with vigor. Lieutenant, thank you. I'm Dr. Harold Green, and this is my daughter. Irene Violet Winona. How do you do? Irene stuck out her hand. She made sure her handshake was firm. Sandy led the pair through the foyer, pointing out the various instruments and rooms left and right. The seamen come here for training, he explained. It's imperative they learn the stars in order to sail. I was a seaman, but they've since taken interest in me and asked me to stay here as a researcher. So I come here daily to map out the night sky in clear, efficient ways to assist with navigation. Do you ever do the night shift? Irene asked. She was walking steadily to his right, holding a confident posture, taking in the activity around her. Sandy smiled. I did it just last week. Irene held eye contact with intent. Oh my, it is something religious, looking through that telescope. He turned to face the doctor. 9.6 inches, that lens is, he said proudly. Dr. Green's jaw dropped. Would you like to see it? Irene and her father once again nodded like toddlers at a candy store. Sandy led them to the back of the ground floor and up a grand flight of stairs to the second level of the building. He then began to climb an iron ladder on the back wall and opened the trap door at the top, motioning for father and daughter to join him. As Irene poked her head through the floor of the loft, she felt as close to outer space as she'd ever been in her life. The wooden dome was everywhere, an amazing piece of architecture that made her feel small and yet a part of a huge world prime for exploration. At the top, around the perimeter of the sphere, was a thin metal bar, and attached to this bar was the telescope. It reached from floor to ceiling and was big and godlike in Irene's eyes. She could hardly fathom what it would be like to look through such a telescope, because seeing it in daylight already transfixed her. Standing in the dome next to such an instrument suddenly rendered her balcony useless. The instrument can move along the top of the dome using this helm. Sandy started turning a wooden wheel that looked like one from a ship, and the telescope slowly began to move along the circumference of the round. In this manner, we can focus in on different angles and sections of the night sky. Being the highest building in the district, we have complete aerial views of the night sky. He enjoyed explaining the instrument to keen ears, feeling a sense of pleasure in their increased awe and wonderment. He continued his impromptu tour. We obviously cannot see the night sky in all of its glory until moonrise, but perhaps I can show you what I've mapped out, Sandy said timidly, unsure of how impressed they'd be with his works in progress. Irene wanted nothing more and told him so. All of the maps in her father's possession were outdated. Her own were the only modern sky drawings she'd ever laid eyes on, and now that she knew the meagerness of her own telescope, she was desperate to see the sky charted from the 9.6-inch beauty she stood next to. So Sandy led them back down the ladder, closing the trapdoor behind him. They descended the staircase back to the first floor and followed him to his office, a modest room with a sky blue ceiling above a desk and chair. Sandy sat, opened the long drawer beneath his desk to pull out the poster, and lay it flat to face Irene and Dr. Green. Irene's eyes scanned the map slowly. The lieutenant had pictured constellations she knew of, in addition to planets and stars she'd never seen before in her life. She was sure, when her eyes arrived at the Little Dipper, she would see her beloved planet Zoque outlined beside it. But Zoque was not there. How could it be that the weak telescope on the balcony had spotted something that Sandy, with his wide-lens telescope, vast dome, and 360-degree mechanical capabilities, had not encountered? She looked at Dr. Green, whose expression suggested that he wondered the same thing. It was very curious, and Dr. Green felt a duty to the name of science to secure his daughter a place at the observatory. It was nearly nightfall, and the president still wasn't in. Sandy, for some reason, felt an obligation to these very eager and curious strangers. He suggested they go for a drink and a meal and return when the sky fell pitch black. Dr. Green, the old man, was falling exhausted from the travel and stimulation. "You go, Irene. I'll go have a lie down at the inn. I'll meet you back at the observatory in a few hours." Irene grew nervous to be without her father, but she was filled with anticipation and couldn't bear to pass the time in a room at the inn. She agreed to join the lieutenant for dinner. Sandy left a note on the president's desk explaining the situation. He wrote that an optometrist from an island far north was looking for work as an astronomer at the observatory. It was a cool spring night. Irene and Sandy walked down a series of sidewalks illuminated by street lamps. Sandy pointed out various memorials and government buildings to Irene as they passed through the Foggy Bottom district. Irene was captivated by the grand architecture and manicured lawns. Sandy articulately relayed the purpose and history of each building, striding with his chin up and gloved hands tied elegantly behind his back, which he unwound when he tipped his hat and smiled to passerby, feeling a lightness in his feet. It was rare he encountered people outside of the observatory, and something about Irene's wonderment made him feel as though she was a lost, thirsty traveler, willing to lap up any drip of information, and he was rewarded by her grateful reception of knowledge of his country's capital. When they completed the tour of Foggy Bottom, they arrived at the pub, a quaint log cabin with a warm glow leaking out of its windows. Sandy ascended the short staircase onto the wooden porch, and held out his hand in invitation. Irene, surprised by herself, took it without hesitation, and the two entered. The pub was quiet and not flashy, rather like someone's personal parlor room, and Irene felt some tension melt away from her shoulders in the heat of the large fireplace blasting in the corner of the room. Sandy beckoned her over to the bar and pulled out a stool for her to sit. He reached for Irene's collar from behind, and she let him slip off her coat and hang it up on the rack before he did the same to his own. The two sat at the bar top, and Sandy waved over the barman. "A glass of red for me, and I'll have the same." Irene smiled at the plump man behind the bar. "2 glasses of red for the lady and I." Irene felt her face grow hot. She had never before been called a lady. Her lips curled as she averted her eyes, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "So tell me, Miss Green, what sort of activities does a young woman concern herself with up in the islands of Nova Scotia?" "Well, Lieutenant, I of course participate in everyday activities, warming the house, preparing the food, clearing the land." She was unsure of how honest to be about her daily life, considering the people of her town deemed her studies inappropriate for a woman with desires to be courted. But she was here for a job, not to attract the lieutenant, so she continued on. "My father and I get the chores done quickly, you see, so that I can focus on my studies." "Your studies?" Sandy asked. "Yes, Lieutenant. I spend much of my days reading, mapping, and hypothesizing, and I spend my nights out on the balcony with my eyes practically locked to the telescope's viewfinder." Sandy, confused, quickly realized that perhaps he had gravely misunderstood the situation, but he didn't want to be rude, so he tread lightly across the conversation. "Ah, yes, the stars are quite romantic, aren't they? And what are the subjects of your daydreams, Miss Green?" Irene scowled, finding his response slightly demeaning. Well, yes, you can call an atmosphere of refracted light coming from fire light years away romantic, or you can ask deeper questions, as I do. For example, does Mars have its own moon? When does our universe end and the next one start? Exactly what is dark matter? Irene was growing animated, her voice soft and intense, her hands motioning as though conducting an orchestra. The barman arrived with their wines with fortuitous timing, for Sandy had to collect himself for a minute. He took a slow sip of wine. Miss Green, here I thought you were merely accompanying your father on his quest for a position at the observatory. I am starting to believe that perhaps I was mistaken, and it is you who is the astronomer. Irene was visibly shocked and felt fury and shame arise from her gut. She supposed her father and she had never clarified exactly who wanted a position at the Naval Observatory. But did the lieutenant think she was agreeing to go on some sort of date with him? She had to swallow her temper. Of course, a man would not expect her to have researched black holes and quantum physics. Lieutenant, all due respect, she scoffed. You believe that I traveled all this way so that my aging father, who, mind you, already has a successful career himself, and not to mention at this point is far less qualified than I for such a duty. She shook her head, restraining herself from reaching a boiling point. You believed I'd accompanied him so that he could secure himself a position? The lieutenant instantly felt awful. How could he not have seen it? All of the questions she was asking him, the way she was eagerly wolfing down information, the way she looked at all of the instruments at the observatory with such admiration. Of course, he cleared his throat. I'm so sorry, Miss Green. I should have guessed. Irene nodded curtly and took a large sip of wine. While he was feeling vulnerable, her anger was morphing into power, and any trace of self-conscious energy was gone. Go big or go home, she thought. And not only am I looking for a position, Lieutenant, I have a research proposal. Oh? I've discovered a new planet, and I intend to find some answers about it. Her eyes burned into his with passion and determination. He had never encountered anyone with such a rigor. They held each other's eyes for a long time. Finally, Sandy gave in to his intrigue. Okay, so tell me about it then. They ordered plates of food and passed the next couple of hours on the topic of Zoké. Irene explained, they both asked questions, both posed hypotheses. Irene had never discussed the planet with someone else who spoke her language, and it was the most natural conversation she'd had with a friend since she was 6 years old. Before they knew it, Irene and Sandy drank 3 glasses of wine each, and nightfall was certainly upon them. Sandy took her coat off the rack and held it in his fists. Irene, he shook his head with disappointment, I left a note for the president saying that your father was the astronomer in question. We have no female astronomers. The president will think you were playing tricks on us. Well, Irene playfully snatched her coat from him. I suppose you'll have to change his mind about me then. She flashed him a smile and assuredly stepped out under the night sky they both knew so well. Dr. Green had been waiting for an hour outside of the locked glass doors on top of the hill at Foggy Bottom. After a nap and a hot slice of pot pie at the inn, he was quite bitter about standing in the cold for so long. He began to worry about Irene. Should he not have permit her to go to dinner with a man they'd only just met? He'd never been forced to exercise control or discipline over his daughter, and wasn't even sure he knew how. Just when he was about to turn around and make his way back to the inn, in case she'd found her way there, a man in a large hat and a long petticoat was making his way up the path. How do you do, sir? Dr. Green stuck out his hand. Dr. Harold J. Green. Lieutenant Peters showed me around the beautiful observatory earlier. He suggested I'd find the president here at nightfall, so here I am. Matthew Fontaine Maury. The man pulled out a set of keys from his pocket and twisted them in the door before shaking the doctor's hand. Pleasure. Dr. Green figured it would be best for him to get out of the cold and wait for his daughter a while at the observatory. He followed President Maury through the foyer, which was now quiet. I presume the lieutenant made you feel welcome earlier? Oh, yes, very much so, sir. He showed us all around. He is now dining with my daughter, though they've been gone quite some time. My daughter and I traveled 3 days south to visit this esteemed program. Ah, a northern man. Whereabout do you come from? The president motioned for his guests to follow him up the staircase. We live on a very remote island off of the Canadian coast, sir. It is a beautiful village, filled with wildlife. I am the town's eye doctor and spectacle maker, and I've used my optometry to craft my very own telescope, which my daughter is very attached to. Well, a lens maker. So what did you think of our prized possession up in the dome? Magnificent, sir. 9.6 inches, that is incredible. I can imagine it would be easy to mistake the sky for solid gold looking through such an instrument. The president laughed. It is quite a treat to peer through. Come to my office for a cup of tea while I get some things in order, and then we can have a look together. The doctor was giddy at the suggestion and hoped Irene would arrive soon to share the spectacle. On the second floor, Maury and Dr. Green arrived at the grand office with many bookcases lining the walls, a large drawing table in the center of the room, and a mahogany desk by a large window. Maury hung up his coat on a rack by the door. Dr. Green was invited to sit before the desk, and Maury circled behind it. Before he sat down, he put on a pair of reading glasses and picked up the notes stacked on top of a few books. Ah, Dr. Green, you come in search of employment. Excellent, excellent. We could use someone with a different sort of background here. Maury took off his glasses and set them back on the desk before taking his seat. Oh, not exactly, sir. You see, my daughter... Just then, there was a knock on the open door that caused the doctor to spin around to find the lieutenant and Irene standing in the doorway. Do come in, Lieutenant. Maury waved them inside and got up to greet them. President, Dr. Green, Sandy shook hands with each of the gentlemen. President, I'd like you to meet Irene Violet Winona Green. Pleasure. Irene nodded and smiled at Maury. Good evening, Miss Green. Maury held out his hand daintily. Irene took it, understanding, with frustration, why the situation may not warrant a proper handshake from the president. Your father was just about to tell me about his qualifications. Do go on, Dr. Green. Maury returned behind the desk, leaving Sandy and Irene standing awkwardly in the doorway. Well, actually, sir, Dr. Green started to correct him when Sandy spoke up. President Maury, sir, there's been a slight misinterpretation on my part. You see, when I met the doctor and his daughter, I presumed that it was he seeking the job. But after spending some time with Miss Green here, I see now that it is really his daughter who has the qualifications to be an astronomer at the observatory. Sandy knew, without hesitation, from the hours he spent speaking with Irene, that she had a vast skill set and a hunger for information that he could not let slip away. And he just hoped the president would give her a chance. But Maury just laughed. It felt like the Christmas party all over again. Irene stormed out of the office and down the staircase, across the foyer and through the glass doors. Dr. Green rushed out to follow her. Had he blown it? Put Irene in a situation that would shatter his daughter's confidence for a final time? He called out to her, but she wouldn't slow her pace. The old man was not in the greatest shape and began having a coughing fit. When Irene realized this, she circled back to her father. They stood catching their breath on the lawn of the building they looked at with awe just that morning. Irene was in tears. Irene, please. He reached for her hand. Who are we kidding, Father? She wiped her face, resigned. I knew they'd never give me a chance. No one ever does. Irene. There are colorful planets out there. I know. There are colorful planets and nobody can see them but us. I know this. But did you ever think that maybe they don't want to see them? That maybe they don't want to see something that a woman saw first? Dr. Green hung his head and looked down at Irene's hand in his. The hand he'd held since it was small. With sinking doubt, he knew he'd done it. This was far too great a risk to take. At least on the island, she could continue to seek her answers. Now that she'd been denied, The doctor was seeing the scenario he'd most feared unravel before him. It was evident in her eyes, her posture, her grip on his hand. She no longer believed in herself. Dr. and Miss Green, my deepest, sincerest apologies on behalf of the president. Sandy had chased them out onto the lawn and stood about 5 feet away, as if keeping his distance. He felt he'd done enough damage already. It's all right, Lieutenant. Irene pulled her hand from her father's and wiped her tears. You tried. He got a glimpse into Irene's genius that night and could not bear to let her board the trains back home. What if... The lieutenant didn't quite know where his thoughts were headed and attempted to collect them quickly in case the Greens started their long journey right then. What if you just stayed here? Irene and her father blinked at him. Lieutenant? She puzzled. No, really. You could stay here. Stay with me. You have so much to uncover about's okay, and I can help. You could be something like my secret weapon. Dr. Green let out a surprised chuckle. That's exactly what his daughter was. Lieutenant, think about it. I have access to the observatory, to our libraries and instruments. You could work on odd hours. We could work together. I have a spare room in my home, and money's not an issue. I don't know, Sandy, that's a lot to think about. She thought of what the women in her town would say. She, an unmarried woman, living in a house with a man she was not wed to? Well, sleep on it. He looked her deeply in the eyes. He was desperate for her not to leave in the morning. Please, Irene. Dr. Green walked slowly towards the lieutenant and put his hand on his shoulder. Come by the inn first thing tomorrow. They shook hands. Thank you, Lieutenant. Thank you for giving my daughter a chance. When Irene arrived at the inn's parlor room early the next morning, without her father, the lieutenant was already sitting, in plain clothes, with a cup of tea at a table by the window. Without his uniform on, he looked younger and softer. Irene felt a tenderness swell up inside her. Sandy looked away from the window, noticed her, and stood. She made her way to him. Without greeting, they took their seats. Sandy stared at her expectantly. Okay, she interrupted the silence. I'll stay. Sandy let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, and a smile cracked across his face. Brilliant, Irene, just brilliant. I know we can do great things together on one condition, Irene interjected. She looked at him sternly and pointed a finger. I may be a secret weapon, but I am no sidekick. I'm not able to be the face of it. She turned her finger around and touched it to her chest. But I am the leader of this operation. You report to me. Doing his best to stifle his grin and come down from the 9th cloud he was on, Sandy nodded and stuck out his hand. Let's do this, Irene Green. They shook on it. And so it began. Irene bid her father, who promised to write every week, a long and hard goodbye. Sandy carried her small suitcase up 2 flights of stairs and into his apartment. Within the matter of one day, her entire life was spun around on its axis. Irene Green, a girl who had spent every day of her life with her father and had barely left her small island, was moving to a big city with a job to do. They began right away. Sandy arranged the night shift for himself every Saturday for the rest of the year, a night the president, a pious man, would never take to ensure that he was fresh for church the next morning. Irene was to accompany him, and they agreed that if they were ever caught, they would pretend that the lieutenant was courting the young lady, attempting to make a lasting impression by showing her the galaxy in a way that only an esteemed astronomer had the access to. Dr. Green was to mail to them all of his personal accounts and whatever was left in his study that regarded Zoké, and in the meantime, Sandy and Irene scored through her own many drawings, notes, and findings. They wrote a new set of questions, in the order they planned to tackle them, on a large chalkboard in Sandy's kitchen, as well as a list of materials they would need to answer these questions. Sandy was to bring home any reading from the observatory that may be pertinent to their search, while Irene was to visit every library she could, private and public, within the city's borders and periphery. Irene had warned Sandy that the planet was only visible on rare occasions, and it may take them several tries to spot it and begin documentation of their observations. She worried that it may even take years for the planet to show itself on the specific night of the week they looked for it. Sandy would stay later any nights the president wasn't there and look out for the planet, but he knew these nights were few and far between. Anticipation and adrenaline coursed through her every cell in the days leading up to her first observation. Irene found it hard to believe that she would be seeing the atmosphere in even more brilliance. There was no one in the entire building except she and Sandy. They once again walked through the open foyer and up to the second floor. She followed him up the iron ladder and found herself in the dome for a second time, gawking at the heavenly instrument. Despite her excitement to experience the sky, she knew that she may be disappointed. She'd come here to discover Zoké, and was prepared for it to take years to come to any sort of conclusion, let alone to catch a glimpse of the bright green mystery. She took a deep breath and began her observation. She was instantly transported into the most vivid picture of the sky she'd ever seen. It felt like she herself was a star. It was so real. She allowed herself to sink into wonderment, just gazing at the scene above her. She felt like she was one with the constellations she'd grown up looking at. Irene stared at each constellation, noticing small detail of star placement and reflections she'd never been able to see before. She moved one by one and was just about to fall into the Little Dipper when she saw it. The faintest green light, so minuscule and dim, she'd almost missed it. Irene could almost hear the planet cry. It was as though it were trying to illuminate itself, like a man hanging off a cliff, trying to hoist himself to safety. Irene wasn't sure how she knew, but her gut told her that Zoké was in trouble. She guided Sandy to it. It felt so validating to share the sight with another scientist. She knew what she'd seen, but Irene supposed there was a part of her that was concerned that no one else could see it. After spending much of the night watching and drawing, the pair knew they should leave and not risk a run-in so soon in their operation. They walked home at dawn, the sky a watercolor of reds and yellows. Irene rubbed her temples, trying to massage the slight headache that arose from spending hours looking through such a powerful telescope. Why was Zoké so faint? I would have never been able to see such a murky star with my father's telescope. This means that when I couldn't see it, Zoké wasn't gone. It was far away. Sandy was on the same page. They turned to face each other, pausing their walk at the edge of Foggy Bottom. Which means that when I could see it, it was close. Yes, it was close, which means that over time, Zoké travels to and from the Earth. Except the schedule that I've seen it on suggests absolutely no consistency in its orbital pattern. So we must keep observing, keep researching. The science will reveal itself. There must just be a long or somewhat conditional temporal component to its path. We'll be able to map it out after more observation. Irene admired Sandy's confidence, but she felt apprehensive. She'd marked Zoké's arrival in her calendars for almost 14 years now, and after her extensive research, it was still a mystery to her why Zoké shone brightly when it did. But now she had another mind pondering the same enigma, so she agreed. In the moments that weren't consumed with work, Irene found herself struggling to adapt to her new life. She'd never shared a home with anyone except her father, and she was unsure of how to conduct herself in the small apartment. Taking close note of Sandy's habits, she did her best to be quiet and courteous, only using the washroom after he did, never lingering too long in any space, sacrificing the heat of her food to clean up after herself immediately after cooking, never putting belongings back a millimeter farther than where she found them. When they were talking about the planet, which was the domineering topic of conversation, Irene felt at ease. But in the first hours of the morning, when she emerged groggily from her bedroom to find him reading the newspaper with a cup of tea, or the final hours of the night when they had wrapped up all formal discussion, she felt nervous and unsure. Then, one day, 3 months after she bid her father goodbye, Irene returned from the library to a marvelous smell coming from the kitchen, and Sandy, home early from work, changed into plain clothes, humming to himself as he stirred a simmering dish. "Oh, good, you're home." He turned to Irene, who was standing reticently in the doorway of the kitchen. "I thought we could take a break for a night. There was a marvelous selection at the market on my way home, and I just couldn't resist. I hope you like ratatouille?" Yes, it smells amazing." Good. Well, it should be ready shortly. Why don't you get washed up and come back for a glass of wine?" "That sounds lovely." She felt her stomach flutter. From that night on, Irene no longer felt out of place, but instead considered herself a woman in love. The two were married in a month's time. Irene continued to update Dr. Green with each and every new finding on Zoe. He'd write her back and offer follow-up thoughts and questions. They missed each other dearly. One Monday morning, after 2.5 years of living in the city, Irene received Dr. Green's final correspondence. "My dearest Renee, I have resisted disclosing news of my illness because you have a job to do that cannot be interrupted for anything. Zoe is larger than any life, mine included. But I'm afraid my condition is not well, sweet daughter. I fear that this may be the last you will hear from this old man. I know that you have read these last few sentences and you are already packing your bags to make the long journey back to me, but I implore you not to do this. I will be past before you arrive, I'm afraid. Though this will be difficult, I beg of you to not let this inevitability stop your life's mission, but rather to use it as a torch to propel you forward. And do not fear for me, for I will become one of your beloved stars in the sky, and we will see each other once each week at the Naval Observatory. Remember, Irene Violet Winona Green, there are colorful planets out there, but nobody can see them. Nobody but you, my dearest. All my love, your father, Harold J. Green." Irene was completely blindsided. She was angry at her father. He wrote her every week, and if he had only given the slightest mention of his illness, she could have seen him one last time. She put the letter on the table and went straight to bed. She would not be working today. As she lay, tears were streaming down her face while she absent-mindedly stared at the architectural patches of sunlight gradually moving across the bedroom wall. For the first time since she was 6, her thoughts orbited completely away from Zoe for an entire day. She thought about her father. She sobbed as she recollected countless joyous memories, building a treehouse together in the yard, or the time she brought an injured dove into the home and he helped her nurse it back to health. She'd think of these things with love, and then her thoughts would shift to resentment, realizing the extent to which her father isolated her, didn't socialize her. It was his fault she was such a late bloomer. He'd always placed all emphasis on work and studies. He did not even write his only child of his illness for fear it would get in the way of her research. And yes, the focus he imparted got her this far, and she was no doubt extremely grateful, but it also held her back from knowing how to have meaningful relationships with other human beings. This was something that, she felt, he not only left her to learn on her own, but even stood in her way of doing. And now that she had such a loving relationship, she begrudged him for not encouraging her or teaching how she could connect with others sooner. But then she'd remember how, occasionally, they'd each look up from their books in the evenings with synchronicity and share a tender smile. How he stroked her hair and made her soup when she was ill, and she'd return to her weeping. The day went on like this, as if she were a ship bobbing up and down in turbulent weather, only she was still as a statue in her bed. When Sandy came home from work, he saw the letter on the table, and his heart sank for his wife. He knocked on the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, revealing a dark room and her legs draped across the bed. Not receiving a response, he pushed the door open slowly. Oh, Irene. He'd never seen her in such a sorry state. He lay beside her, and they embraced until the sun came up the next morning. Irene was a shell of herself for the remainder of the week. She did not leave the house, did not wash, did not eat. She did not read or write, and hardly thought about Zoe. She did not pick up her eyes from staring at the table or out of the window when Sandy came and went. She answered his questions with short responses, and he did not press any further. Then came Saturday, observation night. Sandy figured she wouldn't be attending that week. He resolved to give her as much space to grieve as she needed, for he knew how close she and the doctor were. At sunset, which was usually when they departed for Foggy Bottom, Sandy decided to wash and was starting to prepare supper. But when he emerged out of the washroom, he found Irene ready to leave in the doorway. I figured we would skip this week, because she blinked, staring at him as if he suggested they ride a flying pig to the dome. No, we must go. And so they went. And it's a good thing they did, for it was the first time they made contact with planet Zoe. They'd been tracking the location of Zoe for over 2 years now. Sure enough, as they suspected, it moved to and from Earth. But some weeks it was like a slingshot. It would be bright as Venus, and then the next week it was barely visible. And other times it was way more gradual, moving at a slug's pace. Sometimes it changed direction. It would appear to be on its way away from Earth, and all of a sudden would inch closer before turning back around again. It always went in what appeared to be a straight line coming towards them, never moving side to side, but staggering back and forth. They had notebooks full of measurements and observation, but they hadn't made a dent in solving the mystery. But that night, in 1868, they got all of the explanation they needed. It was a normal Saturday night for them. Irene was peering through the 9.6-inch lens, while Sandy was at the wooden helm waiting for her commands, when all of a sudden, the candles dimmed. All of them, and there must have been at least 30, simultaneously flickered and then regained their glow. Sandy shook his head quickly, sure he must be having some sort of episode. He hadn't eaten all that much that day, he supposed. But then it happened again. And again, and again, in quick succession. "Irene," he exclaimed, "you must look at this." Irene stepped away from the telescope and looked around the dome. It was absolutely alarming. Each candle would simultaneously darken, reducing its flame to a low simmer, and spark again. They were paralyzed with a mixture of intrigue and fear. "Wait a minute," Sandy said after some time. He held a finger up, as if to quiet Irene so he could listen to the tiny flames. "What is it?" Irene inquired after several minutes. "Yes, I'm sure of it," Sandy nodded, and then rushed over to his briefcase sitting just beside the trapdoor. He began rifling through it and came out with a notebook of his. "It's Morse code." He opened the old notebook to a page with a series of dots and lines. Everyone serving the state had to learn Morse code when it was invented here in the 1840s. It's an optical telegraph. I think someone is sending us a message." Irene gasped. She had always felt that Zoe had a sentient nature, but assumed it was her attachment to it that clouded her rationality. But could it be? Could the planet really be trying to communicate with her, its most dedicated worshipper? She brought over a pen and paper to where Sandy was huddled over the chart in his notebook. They held their breath as Sandy moved his gaze from the speaking candles to his legend, to his hand moving across the page. After a few minutes, the candles stopped dancing. For a moment, the gravity was sucked from the room, and Irene and Sandy felt themselves grow heavy. It was as though they were crumbs on the floor, and they could be sucked up by a vacuum at any moment. When the sensation dissipated, Sandy looked down at his notebook. A clear message had been revealed. as your planet takes. Our color is bled dry. Irene could not believe what she had just read. All this time, Zoe was trying to get close enough to speak to anyone who would listen. She had no idea what the message was talking about, but knew that it was a grave warning. They resolved to write out a formal study outlining their findings. They did not quite understand what Zoe was warning against, but knew that if the message was sent to the public, surely it would make sense in time. In their paper, they documented the planet's weekly orbital location, their hypothesis that Zoe was attempting to move closer against the forces of the universe in order to communicate with Earth. Sandy and Irene knew that their document sounded absolutely insane, but their laboratory was the most esteemed in the U.S., and Sandy was a high-ranking lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. With these accreditations attached to the paper, surely it would get at least some recognition. The report was 116 pages long, including graphs, maps, and drawings from over the years on almost every page. They completed writing it in the spring of 1869 and planned to print several copies of the full report and 60 smaller booklets with the information condensed for the layperson. They were determined to spread Zoe's warning at all costs. Foggy Bottom got its name because of its location along the Potomac River, the river at the bottom of the hill that the observatory sat on. Though at the time it was still considered a prime location for the observatory, mists and fogs from the swampy area below often impeded views of the sky. In 1877, just following the discovery of Mars's moons by Asaph Hall, the Naval Observatory was moved from its location atop the highest hill on Foggy Bottom. Cloudy views were not the only reason that this petition to move the observatory came about, though. Each year, a mysterious disease would sweep across the observatory's staff and students from May to October. More than half of the observatory's attendees would sicken, and many would die. Later, it would be discovered that the illness was malaria, caused by the Potomac mosquito. But in 1869, after Sandy and Irene's studies were complete, the cause of the ailments suffered by those in Foggy Bottom were still unknown. Just weeks before they were set to print, Sandy grew ill with the unnamed disease. It took him swiftly and painfully. Irene cared for him. He came home from work one day with what seemed like a flu, and by the next day he was bedridden for 1 week until he took his last breath. She held cool compresses to his head when he grew hot with fever, made him soup and tea that he could not keep down, and held him while he shivered and moaned. After 3 days of this, they both realized that he was going to die. "Irene," he said breathlessly, "we must rush to publish." In tears, she nodded. They both knew that with him dead, their already unbelievable research would not have a chance of being trusted. She was a woman, and a woman publishing such information on her own would be considered hysterical. Without Sandy alive to persuade the public, no one would bother read about Zoe's warning. So, with Sandy sick in bed, Irene got to work. She visited every print shop in the metropolitan area. She was turned down 8 times. 3 shops were too busy. 3 others were too small to do such a hefty job in such a rushed manner. And 2 simply denied her request because they could not fathom a woman having the money or the need to make such a request on her own. After the 8th rejection, she sat down on a park bench, defeated. Her feet ached, and she was exhausted from staying up all night with her deteriorating spouse. The sunset was imminent, and Irene had to return to Sandy, who by now was too weak to fix himself supper. But there was one more shop, slightly on the outskirts of town. After some rest, pure determination pulled her body 4 miles more. The print shop was in a small stone edifice that sat at the corner of a dirty residential street. It was on the 2nd story, and below it was a butcher, which was closed for the day. Irene's stomach churned at the sour smell wafting into the corridor where she trudged up a skinny staircase. A small bell jingled meagerly when she pushed the door of the print shop open. "Hello?" Irene called out. Unlike the other shops she'd attended, which were bustling and loud the minute she entered, there appeared to be nobody there. "Give me a minute." She heard what sounded like a female voice pipe up from a small office in the back. Irene busied herself by reading a news article that was framed up on the wall. It pictured a man and a woman with their arms over each other's shoulders, proudly standing behind their printing press. The headline read, "Husband and wife open commercial print shop in Cowtown." The article went on to elaborate on the achievements of the husband and wife on starting a business in a rougher neighborhood, known for its livestock and slaughterhouses. As she was learning about the husband, formerly a cattleman, a pregnant woman hobbled out to meet her. Irene guessed that the woman was about her own age. "Sorry about that. I was in a bit of a frenzy when you walked in." She held up her hands, which were covered in ink. She wiped them off on a towel that was sitting on the counter. "What can I do you for?" "Not a worry." Irene returned the woman's soft smile and reached into her bag. "How quickly could you print one copy of this?" Irene pushed the full manuscript across the counter. "And 60 copies of this." She slid the shorter form booklet beside it. The woman picked up the booklet and flipped through it. She read it in its entirety, which took about 10 minutes. Irene waited patiently, prepared for another rejection. The woman looked up at Irene from the last page. Irene was shocked to see no judgment in the woman's eyes, but a delicate curiosity. "Why the rush?" She closed the booklet and put it on the counter, leaning her elbow down beside it. She held eye contact with Irene. Irene took a deep breath. "My husband is going to die." She held the breath. The length and disappointments of the day began to catch up with her. She felt her eyes well up with tears and let out a sharp exhale. Something about the pregnant woman's tired gaze made Irene feel she could trust her. "He's going to die, and our work will be all for naught. No one will believe me after he's gone." She began to really cry. She held her head in her hands. "I apologize. It's been a hard week," she sniffled. She felt arms wrap around her neck. The woman had come around the countertop to give her a hug. "I lost my husband just last month," she whispered, and she too began to cry. The two strangers held each other for minutes. When their tears slowed, they pulled away, and Irene started to laugh. She realized they did not know anything about each other. "I'm Irene." She let out a mix between a sob and a chuckle. The woman giggled in exchange, wiping her eyes. "Bertha." She snuffed, straightened her posture, and shook her head quickly, as if shaking away the sadness. "He left me the business." She gestured to the scattered desks and papers floating around her. "So I must carry it in his name, and for our son." She lay her hands on her belly. "And I take it you have a similar situation?" "Something like that." Irene nodded. She wasn't in the mood to go into depth. It was for Sandy. It was for Zoe. It was for her father. It was for this woman standing before her, and that woman's son, and everyone else who had come into this earth. "Come by day after tomorrow eve." Bertha put both of her hands on Irene's shoulders and squeezed. "I will have these ready for you." "Thank you," Irene exhaled, and crossed her right hand across her left shoulder, laying it on top of Bertha's. "I am eternally grateful." Irene walked up Cowtown to Boundary Street, and the landscape returned to manicured parks and sidewalks free of livestock. By the time she reached home, the night was black, and though it wasn't visible by the naked eye, Irene knew Zoe was glowing above her, waiting to see what she would do with its message. She opened the front door quietly, so as not to disturb Sandy's rest. She tiptoed into the bedroom, where he was sleeping with labored breath, and undressed silently, slipping into her nightgown. When she lay beside him, she felt him stir. "Reenie," he choked out. "Sandy." She put her palm on his cheek. "I'm here, darling. I'm here." "Reenie," he wheezed again and swallowed painfully. "I'm going to die before we publish." She nodded slowly. This much was obvious. "I'm going to die, And you have to get the word out, Irene, whatever it takes. He dragged his hand up to squeeze hers on his cheek. Tears streamed down her face. "There are colorful planets out there," she quoted her father, "and nobody can see them." "Nobody but you," Sandy whispered. When Irene returned to Cowtown very early one morning to pick up her copies, she'd lost Sandy. The sun had just set when she pushed the door open to trigger the weak bell. Oh. Bertha was trying to mop a stain of ink from the floor when she looked up to find a woman with red puffy eyes who clearly hadn't slept or washed in days. Irene let herself sink into another hug from Bertha, who was still a stranger. "Let me make us some tea," Bertha said warmly when they pulled away. She beckoned Irene, who followed her as she hobbled into the back office. Irene sat on a small sofa and took in her surroundings. The office, like the front end of the shop, was in complete disarray. Irene took the mess as evidence that after 1 month, Bertha's grieving period was still ongoing. The scattered office tools and piles of papers were likely an indicator of Bertha's internal chaos. Irene wondered what state her own mind would be in 1 month, considering her own grief was just beginning. Bertha set out a steaming pot of tea, 2 mugs, and some cookies. As Irene picked up the treat, she held it up to eye level, realizing she hadn't had anything to eat since the last time she was at the shop. Bertha must have noticed her staring at the pastry in her hand. "I didn't eat for weeks," she said, picking up a cookie herself. "But then one morning, a thunderous sound woke me up. I could not figure out what it was for the life of me. It just kept rumbling, like the sounds of a hurricane. Then I felt kicking." She placed her cookieless hand on her belly. "And I realized it wasn't even my stomach." She took a bite, and, smirking, she chewed slowly and swallowed. It was the baby's. Irene laughed for what felt like the first time in years, and it felt so good to laugh after so many tears that she just kept going. Bertha laughed too, and the women were chuckling uncontrollably, wiping their eyes, stopping in attempt to catch their breath and not choke on their cookies. When the laughter faded, the mood grew solemn again. Bertha nodded and said, almost to herself, "It was the baby's." She looked up at Irene. "And you have a baby of sorts, too." She gestured to the box of pamphlets beside them. "Do you need help passing them out?" Irene nodded eagerly, stunned by Bertha's kindness. She took her hand. "I don't know what I'd do if I hadn't met you when I did." So the 2 women made their way around the 7 wards of the District of Columbia. They passed the pamphlets out to pedestrians, left them on tabletops at pubs and inns, and inserted them into the stacks of bookstores, libraries, and newsstands. All 60 booklets were dispersed. The word was out. With the pamphlets passed out, Irene returned home, where she read through the 116-paged report. She checked for errors, of which there were none. She was ready. She slipped the report into her bag and took herself to Foggy Bottom to climb up the hill to the observatory one final time. Without Sandy there, she wasn't quite sure how she could manage to convince Maury of their findings, considering she had deceptively conducted the research in Maury's own facilities right under his nose. But the lieutenant was there, and his name was also on the report, so Irene felt she had to try. She walked up the staircase she'd ascended many times before and came upon the large doors guarding Maury's office. She braced herself and knocked. Come in," she heard the president say absent-mindedly. When she opened the door, his head was down, surveying a large map laid across his table. He still hadn't looked up when she entered the room, so she cleared her throat. Maury glanced up, his expression morphing to surprise. He removed his reading glasses and put them down on the table, straightening his posture. "Mr. President," Irene began nervously, "I know well that I may not be welcome here, but I have a report to deliver from the lieutenant and I." She held out the paper. He glanced down at it, then back up at her. "And where is the lieutenant, then?" He left Irene's arm outstretched. Irene placed the report on the table. "He died, sir. He sighed and softened. "I am sorry to hear that." "Thank you, sir." "But I cannot accept this report, Miss Green." He pushed it back to her. She held stern eye contact with him, fury rising inside her. She knew that Maury had some inkling as to her capabilities. He respected the lieutenant, yet he didn't respect her, despite knowing that Irene came to Washington to be an astronomer. Maury just refused to see that Irene was intelligent and had ideas to bring to the table. And though it was going to have profound consequences on the planet's future, Irene did not have any power to convince him to consider their findings. Irene scoffed, defeated. She shook her head, left the report on his table, and left without a word. She'd never returned to the observatory again.